The horse smelled the cold before Harlan Greer did. It slowed without being asked, ears forward, breath coming out in short white bursts against the October air. Harlan let it slow. He was in no hurry. The morning was clear and hard, the kind of clear that only comes to Montana in late October when the sky has finally decided what it intends to do with the year. Blue overhead, gray at the edges, and on the northern horizon something darker that hadn't been there the day before. He was riding the ridge trail north of the settlement, checking fence line the way he did every few weeks when he saw her. At first he wasn't sure what he was seeing, a figure on the hillside moving slowly bent low. He thought it might be one of the Beaumont boys dragging timber, but the Beaumont place was 3 miles east, and as he rode closer, the figure resolved itself into something he hadn't expected. A woman, alone, hauling stones. Not small stones either. River rock and sandstone pulled from the ridge loaded onto a flat wooden sled she had built herself from what looked like 2 warped planks and a length of rope. The sled had no runners worth speaking of. It scraped the ground with every pull, and she pulled it anyway, leaning forward into the weight boots, finding purchase in the loose hillside soil, arms straining against the rope that crossed her shoulders like a harness. Harlan Greer stopped his horse at the edge of the trail and watched. He was 52 years old and had been running cattle in Judith Basin for 11 of those years. He had built 2 cabins with his own hands, hired men to build a third, and overseen the construction of a bunkhouse that had stood through 6 Montana winters without losing so much as a shingle. He knew building, he knew this country, and he knew with the particular certainty of a man who has survived long enough to stop questioning his own instincts that what he was looking at was a mistake. The woman was Eleanor Vance. He knew her by the gray wool coat and the way she moved, purposeful, contained with nothing wasted. He had seen her at the settlement store twice since her husband died. She had nodded at him both times. He had nodded back. That was the extent of it. Her husband, Cormac Vance, had been a freight man, good with horses, decent with his hands, quiet in the way that either meant a man was thoughtful or had simply run out of things to say. He had died 2 winters back when his wagon broke through ice on the Judith River. Happened fast the way those things do. One moment a man is crossing a river he has crossed 20 times before. The next moment the river has him. Eleanor had stayed on the claim after that. Most people expected her to leave. A widow with 2 young children, 40 miles from the nearest town of any size with a homestead that barely cleared enough to get through winter. The sensible thing, the thing people quietly expected and privately hoped for, because it would have confirmed what they already believed about the limits of a woman alone, was to pack what she could carry and go back east. She had not gone back east. She had stayed and planted and harvested and survived 2 more winters in the log cabin Cormac had built. And now apparently she had decided to tear up the hillside and build something out of stone. Harlan watched her drag the sled another 20 feet and set it down. She straightened slowly, pressed one hand against the small of her back, and looked at what she had already stacked near the flat ground at the base of the hill. There was more stone there than he had expected. She had been doing this for a while. He almost called out, almost asked what she was building. But something stopped him, not politeness exactly, but the practical instinct of a man who has learned that asking questions obligates you to care about the answers. He didn't want to be obligated. He had enough on his land to manage without adding a widow's construction project to the list of things that required his attention. So he watched for another moment, and then he made a decision about what he was seeing. She will not make it through the winter in whatever that becomes. He rode on. Eleanor did not watch him go. She had seen him stop on the ridge trail. She had registered the shape of him, the broad shoulders, the dark coat, the particular stillness of a man who is observing rather than passing through, and she had made her own decision about it. She turned back to her sled. The stone wasn't going to haul itself. She had been at it since before first light, the way she had been at it every morning for the past 3 months, since the snow melted enough in April to expose the hillside and show her what was there. Sandstone from the upper ridge, dense and workable. River rock from the creek bed below, rounded and smooth, good for filling gaps, and for the firebox where irregular shapes held mortar better than flat surfaces. Limestone from the old Buffalo Wallow to the east, heavier than it looked, worth the trouble for the north wall, where she needed the most mass. She had hauled it all herself, not because she couldn't ask for help. There were men in Judith Basin who would have brought a wagon and spent a Saturday hauling stone in exchange for a meal and the satisfaction of having helped a widow. That kind of help existed here. It was real, and she did not dismiss it. But she had learned in the 2 years since Cormac died that help came with opinions. And the opinions, more often than not, came with the quiet assumption that the person offering them knew better than she did what she needed and how to get it. She was tired of that assumption. She was tired of managing other people's certainty about her situation while also managing the situation itself. So she hauled her own stone, and she built her own walls, and she let the opinions find somewhere else to land. The idea had come to her the previous winter, not as a sudden inspiration. Nothing about Eleanor Vance worked by sudden inspiration. It came to her the way most useful things came slowly at the edge of exhaustion, when the mind finally lets go of what it thinks it knows and starts paying attention to what is actually there. It had been February, the worst stretch of a winter that had already been bad. Seth had been sick for 2 weeks, a cough that had settled into his chest the way childhood illness does when a house cannot stay warm. She had been burning wood around the clock, feeding the stove every 2 hours, and still the far corners of the cabin were cold enough to keep meat. The floor was so cold that she had the children sleep in the loft closer to the ceiling, where the heat tried to collect before it escaped through every gap in the logs. She was sitting by the stove at 3 in the morning, waiting for it to need feeding again, and she was thinking about her father. Silas Webb had been a stonemason from Cornwall, England, who had come to America when Eleanor was 3 years old and had spent the next 30 years building things in southern Colorado that he said would outlast everyone who criticized them. He had been right about that. He built root cellars and storage rooms and one small stone house for a sheep farmer outside of a pueblo, and every one of those structures had the same quality that Eleanor remembered most clearly about them. They held temperature, not perfectly, not magically, but they held it the way nothing made of wood ever quite managed. You could walk into one of her father's stone rooms in July when the Colorado sun was trying to cook everything above ground and find air inside that was 10 degrees cooler than the air outside. And in winter, she remembered this distinctly from childhood visits to the sheep farmer's stone house. You could let the fire burn down to coals at midnight and wake in the morning to a room that was still warmer than the air outside. The stone had taken the heat and held it and given it back slowly through the night. Wood fights the cold and loses every time, her father used to say, in the particular accent that never quite left him, no matter how many years he spent in America. Stone doesn't fight, stone simply waits it out. She had grown up with that idea. She had never needed to use it before. Sitting by the stove at 3 in the morning, listening to Seth's rough breathing from the loft above her, she needed it now. By May, the ground had thawed enough to work with, and Eleanor had already chosen her site. Not where the old cabin stood. She would keep the cabin. It had its uses storage mostly, and she didn't have the time or energy to tear it down, but the new structure would sit 40 feet to the west at the base of the hillside where the slope gave her something to work with. Her father had taught her this too, though she hadn't understood it as a lesson at the time. She had understood it only as observation. His best buildings always used the land itself as part of the structure. The north wall of the sheep farmer's stone house was built directly into a low hillside buried 3 feet into the earth on its outer face. The hill became insulation. The cold that came from the north had to get through several feet of frozen ground before it ever reached the stone, and by then it had given up most of what it had. Eleanor's site gave her a natural slope on the north side. She would cut into it, sink the north wall into the earth, and let the hill do half the work for her. The structure would be small, 16 feet by 20. Smaller than the old cabin. She was not building for space. She was building for warmth. The walls would be thick, not for strength, though they would be strong, but because thickness was the whole point. 2 feet at the base. Mass was what held heat. Mass was what gave it back. A thin wall was just a barrier. A thick wall was a battery. The ceiling would be low. 7 feet at the peak. Heat rises. If the ceiling is low, there is less volume for the heat to fill before it starts warming the people in the room. Every foot of ceiling height you add is another foot of air. The fire has to heat before anyone feels it. 2 windows both on the south wall to catch the low winter sun and let it add to what the fire was doing. Covered with oiled canvas because glass was expensive and canvas worked nearly as well for the purpose. The door set deep into the stone frame facing southeast, protected from the north wind by the angle of the building. The firebox built from dense river rock against the west wall. Short chimney, just enough to draw smoke, not so much that it pulled warm air out of the room along with it. She had worked all of this out on paper first, with a stubby pencil in the back of a ledger book, the way her father had taught her to think through a structure before touching a single stone. He had given her his weighted plumb line when she left Colorado at 19. She still had it. She would use it on every wall. In June, Aldous Pritchett came to see what she was doing. Aldous was 48 years old and had been the best carpenter in Judith Basin for as long as anyone could remember. He built cabins that were straight and tight and weatherproof, and he was proud of this in the specific way that skilled tradesmen are proud, not boastfully, but with an absolute underlying confidence that his way of doing things was the correct way of doing things, and that deviations from it were either ignorance or stubbornness. He arrived on a Tuesday morning with two other men from the settlement, Decker Oaks and a homesteader named Birch Calloway, who had recently staked a claim 3 miles south. They were not precisely inspecting her work. They were in the area, as Aldous explained it, checking on the Calloway claim, and they had come this way by coincidence. Eleanor had been on the frontier long enough to know that almost nothing happened by coincidence. She kept working while they watched. She was laying the third course of the north wall, pressing each stone carefully into the mortar mix she had made from clay sand and a small amount of lime she had traded for at the settlement store. She checked her plumb line after every 3 stones. Aldous watched this for a few minutes. Then he walked along the base of the wall and crouched down to look at the mortar joints. "Clay mortar," he said. "Clay and sand, some lime. Won't hold in freeze-thaw cycles. Lime mortar is what you need. Proper lime, not the little bit you've got here. It will cure and harden over the summer. By winter, it'll be set." Aldous stood up. He looked at the wall. He looked at the thickness of it. He looked at the way the north side was cut into the hillside. "This is going to sweat," he said. He said it not to Eleanor, but to the air between himself and the two men behind him, as though he were making a professional observation to colleagues. "Stone holds moisture, especially in a structure like this with minimal ventilation. You'll have water running down the inside of these walls by January. Mold by February. I've seen it." Birch Calloway nodded slowly, the way men nod when they want to look like they're following a technical discussion. "The ventilation is managed through the door in the chimney draw," Eleanor said. "That's not enough for a sealed stone structure. Wood breathes, stone doesn't. You're going to trap moisture inside here, and it's going to undo everything you've built." Eleanor set down the stone she was holding and looked at him directly for the first time since he'd arrived. "My father built in stone for 30 years, she said, "in Colorado, structures that are still standing. I've been inside them. Colorado is a different climate. The principle is the same." Aldous looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the wall again. Then he looked back at Birch Calloway, and something passed between them. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one, the social signal that says we have heard what we needed to hear, and he turned back toward the horses. "It's your land," he said. "Build what you want on it." They rode south. Birch Calloway did not come with the wagon of stone he had mentioned to Eleanor the week before when she had run into him at the settlement store, and he had offered to haul a load from the creek bed. She had not asked him for the favor. He had offered. She had said it would be helpful. He never came. Eleanor went back to hauling her own stone. Ada was 9 years old and had her father's dark eyes and her mother's way of watching things carefully before deciding what she thought about them. She had been following Eleanor to the construction site since June, walking the half-mile from the old cabin with Seth beside her, carrying water and the noon meal in a cloth sack. Seth was sick, still round-cheeked, with a tendency toward chest colds that had started the first winter after Cormac died and had not entirely left him since. He was a good-natured child who adapted easily to circumstances, which was fortunate, because the circumstances of his life required considerable adaptation. Ada watched her mother work and asked questions. "Why does it have to be so thick?" "Because thick walls hold heat the way a heavy coat holds body warmth. A thin coat lets the cold through. A thick wall keeps it out." "Why not just build the walls thicker on the old cabin?" "You can't add thickness to a log wall from the outside. The logs are already there. You'd have to start over." Ada considered this. "So you're starting over?" "Yes." "Does it scare you?" Eleanor thought about this question more than it probably warranted. "No," she said finally. "What scared me was another winter in a house that couldn't keep you warm. This doesn't scare me." Seth, sitting on a flat rock nearby eating an apple, said nothing. He had not yet made up his mind about the stone structure. It looked to him like something you dug rather than built like a root cellar or a grave, and he said so one afternoon in August with the directness of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned that some thoughts benefit from being kept inside. It looks like a place where you put dead things, he said. It looks like that from outside, Leonard said. Come inside. She took his hand and led him through the door frame. The door itself had not been hung yet into the half-finished interior. It was dim lit only by the 2 canvas windows on the south wall and the open door behind them. The stone walls rose on all 4 sides. The log roof beams were in place, waiting for the sod layer that would go over them. Put your hand on the wall, Eleanor said. Seth put his small hand flat against the sandstone of the west wall. The stone was still warm from the afternoon sun. He looked surprised. It's warm, he said. It took the sun in all day, and it's holding it. Tonight, when the air gets cold, it'll still be warm. Not hot, just warm, like a hand that's been holding yours. Seth stood with his palm against the stone for a moment. He was thinking in the way children think when something has genuinely surprised them rather than merely interested them. Okay, he said. I don't think it's a grave anymore. By September, the walls were up, the roof was laid, the chimney was set, and the door was hung. Eleanor stood back and looked at it. It was not beautiful. It never would be. The walls were rough and irregular where different stone types met. The roof sat low and heavy, sod-covered and uneven brownish gray against the hillside. From the trail, it looked like something the land had made by accident rather than something a person had built on purpose. But it was done, and it was hers, and hers. And it had been built to the measurements her father had taught her, with the plumb line he had given her using stone she had hauled herself from 3 different sources across her own land. She walked inside. The air was still. Not stale, the chimney drew a steady, gentle current, but still in the way of rooms that have been sealed against the outside world. She stood in the center of the single main room and turned slowly. The stone was warm where the south wall had caught the afternoon sun. The floor tamped earth covered with the rough pine planks she had salvaged from the old cabin's spare lumber was solid underfoot. The firebox against the west wall was cold now, waiting. She thought about her father. She thought about the sheep farmer's stone house outside of Pueblo, and the way the air inside it had always felt different from the air in the wooden buildings around it. Contained, steady, like the air in a cave, but warmer. She thought about Seth's thin chest and the sound of his breathing in February. She thought about Cormac going out into the dark for the 5th time in one night to get more wood. She did not let herself stay with that thought for long. She had a habit of allowing grief a certain amount of space and then withdrawing from it before it expanded to fill everything. That discipline had kept her functional for 2 years. She intended to keep it. Nora Hewitt came in the first week of October. She was the settlement school teacher, 38 years old, a woman from Ohio who had come west with a husband who had subsequently left her with 2 opinions about everything and no forwarding address. She had stayed on and made herself useful, and she was sharp-eyed and direct in the way of women who have given up on the social performance of uncertainty. She walked around the exterior twice before she said anything. It looks like something you bury things in, not live in, she said. Come inside, Eleanor said. Nora stepped through the door with the particular posture of a woman who has already decided what she thinks but is willing to be temporarily surprised. She stood in the middle of the room. She put her hand on the south wall. She looked up at the low ceiling. She looked at the narrow windows. It's dark, she said. In winter, darkness is warmth. The windows let in enough light during the day. At night, you have the fire. It's very small, 16 by 20, same as most claim cabins. Most claim cabins have ceilings higher than this. Higher ceilings let the heat escape. Lower ceilings keep it where the people are. Nora stood for another moment, and Eleanor watched her working through it, the teacher's habit of testing information against what she already knew, looking for contradictions. Finding none apparently because she nodded once and said, I hope it works the way you think it will. So do I, Eleanor said. It was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in months. Harlan Greer came past one last time in mid-October, and this time he stopped long enough to say something. The hut was finished by then, and it sat on the hillside exactly as it would sit for the next 140 years. Low, thick-walled, unremarkable from the trail, looking like something the earth had pushed up rather than something a person had built down. Harlan sat his horse and looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Eleanor, who was splitting wood near the lean-to. "I've seen root cellars built with more dignity than this," he said. Eleanor set the axe head on the ground and rested her hands on the top of the handle. "It's warm," she said. Harlan looked at the structure again. Something in his expression shifted, not doubt exactly, but something adjacent to it, a small adjustment in the certainty that had been there before. He was a man who had built good cabins. He knew what made it a building work in this climate. He looked at the thick walls and the low roof and the way the north side disappeared into the hillside, and something about it nagged at him, the way a wrongly set fence post nags at a man who builds fences for a living. He did not say anything else. He clicked his horse forward and rode on. Behind him, Eleanor picked up the axe and went back to splitting wood. The sky to the north had gone dark again, darker than the morning, darker than it had been all week. The first serious clouds of the season were building over the mountains, and the air had that particular stillness that comes just before the character of a Montana autumn changes from difficult to dangerous. She had a cord and a half of wood already stacked under the lean-to. She had been told by 3 people in the settlement that she would need at least 4 cords to make it through winter in a cabin that size. She had listened. She had nodded. She had stacked 1.5 cords and stopped because she believed, not hoped, not wished, but believed that 1.5 cords would be enough. She was about to find out whether her father's understanding of stone and cold and patience was worth more than every opinion that had been offered to her since May. She split the last log on the block and added it to the stack. Above the mountains to the north, the clouds were building into something serious. Winter was not coming. Winter was already here, deciding when to arrive. The first snow came on the 2nd of November. Not the blizzard, not yet. Just the announcement of it, a steady, quiet fall that began before dawn and continued through the morning, covering the frozen ground in 4 inches of white that muffled every sound in Judith Basin and made the world feel smaller than it already was. By noon, the snow had stopped, and the sky had cleared to that hard, brilliant blue that Montana produces in early winter, like a warning dressed as beauty. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the stone hut and looked at it. The landscape had changed overnight in the way it always did with first snow. Every familiar shape made unfamiliar by the white layer on top of it, distances harder to judge, the creek invisible now, except for the dark line of willows that marked its course. The old cabin 20 feet away looked smaller in the snow. The wood stack under the lean-to looked adequate. The hillside behind the stone hut had absorbed the snow and darkened rather than whitened the earth, too dense and too well insulated to let the cold reach the surface the way it reached everything else. She had moved the children into the stone hut 10 days earlier when the first hard frost came and the old cabin dropped to 40 degrees by morning, despite a fire kept burning all night. The transition had been practical and without ceremony. Ada had carried her blanket and her books. Seth had carried his wooden horse and a sack of his clothes and had spent the first night lying in the loft with his eyes open, listening to the new silence of the stone walls. "It doesn't make noise," he said. "What doesn't?" "The wind. In the old cabin, you could hear it all the time trying to get in. Here it's quiet." Eleanor had been building the fire for the night. She paused at what he said. "That's right," she said. "It is quiet." She had not consciously noticed it until that moment. The old cabin had been full of the sound of weather wind finding gaps, the creak of logs contracting in cold, the particular whistle that came through the north-facing corner, no matter how many times she packed it with moss. The stone hut was quiet in a way that had no equivalent in her experience of wooden buildings. The walls did not flex. They did not breathe. They stood absolutely still and let the wind go around them. Seth had been right. It was a different kind of shelter. November moved forward the way a bad year ends, with a kind of grim patience each day, a little darker, a little colder. The light arriving later and leaving earlier, until the hours of useful daylight felt less like a gift and more like a concession. Eleanor kept to her routine. Up before light fire built from coals, she banked carefully each night, breakfast for the children aided to her lessons at the settlement school. When the trail was passable, Seth staying home on the days when the air had a bite that made his chest tighten. She watched the wood stack and felt something she recognized as confidence but refused to call it that yet. She had burned perhaps a quarter of what she had stacked in the first 2 weeks of November. Her rate of consumption was slower than anything she had experienced in the old cabin, slower by more than half. The fire in the stone hut did not need to be fed through the night. She banked it at 10. She woke at 6 to coals that still held enough heat to restart with one piece of dry wood and a breath of air. The stone had taken the evening heat in and returned it slowly through the dark hours, and by morning the room had lost perhaps 10 degrees from its warmest point. In the old cabin by morning she had often been able to see her breath. She did not say any of this to anyone. She went to the settlement store twice in November for salt and oil and a small sack of coffee, and she listened to what people were saying, and she said very little back. The talk was about winter coming, the way it always was in October and November in Montana, but there was something different in the quality of the talk this year. A tension underneath it, a sense that this winter intended something the previous ones had not. Old Martin Sproul, who had trapped and traded in Judith Basin since before most of the current settlers had arrived, said in the store one afternoon that he had not seen a season turn this way in 20 years. He said it quietly without drama, the way men who have survived a long time say things they know are true but would prefer not to say. Eleanor bought her coffee and went home. On November 18th, the sky fell. There was no other way to describe it. Eleanor had seen hard weather before. She had been through 3 Montana winters, and the first of them, the winter after Cormac died, had been genuinely brutal cold enough and long enough that she had rationed food in January and wood in February and hope in March. She knew what bad winter looked like. This was different. It began the way Martin Sproul's careful tone had suggested it might, with a drop in temperature, so sudden and so deep that it felt less like cooling and more like something being taken away. The thermometer on the outer wall of the old cabin Cormac had put it there, and she had never moved it, read 12 degrees at noon on the 18th. By 3 in the afternoon, it read 4. By the time Eleanor closed the stone hut door for the night, it was below zero and still falling, and the wind had come down from the mountains in a way that was not weather but assault. The snow came with it, not falling driving, horizontal in the gusts, packed and hard, finding every surface and scouring it. Within 2 hours of full dark visibility was nothing. The world outside the stone hut was a single undifferentiated white roar, and it pressed against the walls with a physical force that Eleanor could feel through her feet. She added one log to the fire. 1. She checked the door set deep in its stone frame, sealed with the heavy pine threshold Cormac had planed smooth on his last autumn, and it was solid. She went up to the loft and checked the children. Ada was already asleep. Seth was awake, eyes wide, listening. "Is it bad?" he asked. "It's a big storm," she said. "We're all right. I can hear it on the roof. That's the sod shifting. It's supposed to do that. It's settling under the weight of the snow. It makes it better, not worse." Seth looked at her with that particular expression children produce when they are not entirely certain that they believe what they are being told, but have decided to believe it anyway because the alternative is worse. "Okay," he said. She sat with him until his eyes closed. Then she went back down to the fire, added nothing to it, and sat in the chair by the firebox to listen. 3 miles south and east, Harlan Greer was burning his third armload of wood since midnight. His cabin was the best-built structure in the settled part of Judith Basin. He had always been certain of this. Heavy pine logs, carefully checked with oakum rather than the moss and mud most homesteaders used. A stone hearth with a proper draw that he had spent 3 days setting right. Double-hung shutters on all the windows. He had put this cabin together with the care of a man who intended it to stand for generations, and it had stood well through every winter he had put it through. This winter was testing things he had not known were there to test. The wind found angles. That was the only way he could describe it to himself in the long, cold hours of the first night. He had sealed every joint he could identify, and the wind found angles he had not identified, the junction between the top log course and the roof beam, where expansion and contraction over 6 years of freeze and thaw had opened a gap you could almost not see but could absolutely feel. The corner behind the stove where 2 walls met and the chinking had worked loose. The bottom of the east window where the frame had settled a 1/4 inch over the summer. Individually, none of these gaps would have mattered. Together, in a wind that was coming from 3 directions at once and hitting the cabin in rotating bursts, they constituted a kind of slow bleeding. The cabin lost heat through 100 small wounds he could not find in the dark. He fed the fire. He went back to bed. He lay there until the cold at the edges of the room began to reach him again, and then he got up and fed the fire again. By dawn of the second day, the woodpile under the south eave was down by 1/3. He had not slept more than 2 hours straight. In the settlement, Aldous Pritchett's cabin was undergoing its own education. Aldous had built his own home with the same expertise he brought to every commission: tight joints, seasoned timber, a good stone hearth with a draw calculated to move smoke without pulling warmth. He was a craftsman, and his home reflected it. But craftsmanship on this particular night was running into something older than craft. His children, two boys, 12 and 9, were sleeping in the main room near the hearth, wrapped in coats that were meant for outdoor work. The upstairs bedroom where Aldous and his wife slept was functional in October and cold in November, and on this night genuinely uninhabitable. Ice had formed in the corners where the walls met the ceiling. Not frost, ice. By the second day, he had burned through his accessible wood and broken up a chair for the hearth. He told himself the chair was old and he had been meaning to replace it. This was true. It did not make the act of burning it feel less like a signal of something. His wife, who had grown up in Minnesota and had her own deep knowledge of what winter could do, said nothing. She kept the fire and she kept the children close to it. And she did not say what she was thinking, because what she was thinking was that the house was losing this fight and that a man who had spent 20 years building houses for other people should know how to prevent that. Aldous Pritchett, sitting by his hearth with a broken chair burning in it, was beginning to think the same thing. Nora Hewitt left her cabin on the third day. She had held on longer than most, partly from stubbornness and partly from a school teacher's habitual belief that problems submitted to with sufficient discipline could be managed. She had managed the first night with extra blankets. She had managed the second night by sleeping in front of the stove in her sitting room. On the morning of the third day, she woke to find that the water in the basin she kept on her kitchen shelf had frozen solid, and that she could see light through two places in her north wall where the chinking had failed entirely. She packed a bag dressed in everything she owned and walked 40 yards through a blizzard to the home of the Decker Oaks family, where 3 adults and 4 children were already sharing the main room around a fire that was burning down faster than they could feed it. She arrived with snow packed into the folds of her coat and ice on her eyebrows. Decker Oaks opened the door and looked at her with an expression that contained both relief and a kind of grim recognition. Relief that she had made it, recognition that her being here meant one more person competing for the warmth that the room was already failing to produce. "Sit close," he said. "We've got enough wood for another day, maybe 2. Nora sat close. She thought about Eleanor Vance alone in a stone hut 3 miles north, and she felt something uncomfortable that she recognized as a mixture of concern and something else she was not yet ready to name. 3 miles north, on the second morning of the storm, Seth Vance developed a fever. Eleanor discovered it at first light when she came up to wake the children and found him hot to the touch. Not sweating, the room was not hot enough for sweating, but carrying the specific dry heat of a child's body fighting something off. His eyes were bright and his movements were slower than usual, and he complained that his head hurt. She brought him down to the main room and settled him near the firebox with a blanket and a cup of water heated on the coals. She felt his forehead again. She felt the glands in his neck. She made the calculations that mothers make in the absence of doctors. How hot is too hot? How long before this becomes something that cannot be managed at home? What are the things she would need, and does she have them? She had willow bark dried the previous spring. She had chamomile. She had the knowledge passed from her own mother and from 3 winters of managing Seth's recurring chest complaints of what a fever that needed watching looked like versus what a fever that needed intervention looked like. This one felt like watching. But, standing in the stone hut at first light, with the wind roaring outside and her son burning beside her, Eleanor felt something that she had not allowed herself to feel since May. Not fear exactly, something quieter and more internal than fear. A questioning. What if Aldous Pritchett was right? The thought came without invitation and would not leave when she tried to dismiss it. She had been so certain. She had been certain in the way her father was certain, not arrogantly, but fundamentally at the level where knowledge lives rather than opinion. She had built what he had taught her to build, and she had trusted that it would work. But Seth was feverish, and the wind outside sounded like something alive and enraged. And the stone hut, for all its warmth, was still a structure she had built alone without help against the expressed professional opinion of the most experienced builder in the county. What if the moisture was there building inside the walls, invisible until spring, when it would reveal itself as exactly the failure Aldous had predicted? What if the clay mortar was failing in the freeze-thaw cycle, weakening invisibly, and the walls that felt solid were becoming something else? What if she had built her children into a mistake? She stood in the center of the room and she let the thought be there. She did not fight it. Fighting it would have taken energy she needed for other things, and she had learned that some fears need to be looked at directly rather than pushed away. Then she did the thing her father had taught her when a building was making him uncertain. She inspected it. She went to the north wall first, the buried wall, the one most likely to carry moisture. She put both palms flat against the stone and held them there. The stone was cool, significantly cooler than the south wall or the firebox wall, but not cold, not damp. She pressed into the mortar joints with her fingers, checking for the soft, crumbling texture that moisture damage produces. The joints were hard. The clay had set solid over the summer and hardened further in the dry autumn air, exactly as she had said it would. She moved along the north wall, checking every foot of it. Hard, dry, solid. She checked the east wall. The same. She checked the corners where moisture and failure begin when they begin. Hard, dry. The junction between the north and east walls was, if anything, the tightest joint in the structure. She had been most careful there, knowing that corners were where buildings confess their weaknesses. She checked the floor around the base of each wall for dampness. The tamped earth was dry. She stood back and looked at what she had checked and felt the fear move through a doorway in her mind and diminish on the other side of it, not gone, but manageable, reduced to its proper size. The building was sound. Seth's fever was Seth's fever, not a verdict on the building, just a child's body working the way children's bodies work in winter. She had seen it before. She would see it again. She made the willow bark tea and brought it to him. "It tastes bad," he said. "It works better than it tastes." He drank it. She sat beside him. The fire held steady. The stone walls held steady. Outside, the blizzard held steadiest of all, driving snow against the south windows with a sound like handfuls of sand thrown hard. Seth's fever broke the following morning without further assistance. He asked for porridge and then fell back asleep, which Eleanor took as the best possible sign. In 48 hours, he was playing in the loft again, apparently not inconvenienced by the fact that the world outside was trying to end. It was Cabell Morrow who arrived on the morning of the fourth day. He came from the north, which told Eleanor, before he even spoke, that he had been caught out in the open. There was nothing north of her claim but high country and the mountains, and no reason to be coming down from that direction, unless you had been somewhere in it when the storm hit. He knocked at the door at first light. Eleanor opened it. The man outside was large, 6 feet and broad, through the shoulders, 55 years old, built by 3 decades of trapping and wilderness work into something that resembled timber more than flesh. His beard was ice. His coat had snow packed into every fold of it. His hands, when he held them out toward the warmth from the open doorway, were the color of raw meat and shaking with a fine, continuous tremor. She brought him inside without asking questions. There would be time for questions. First, warmth. She sat him in the chair closest to the firebox and gave him the blanket from the loft. Ada's blanket, the heavy wool one, and put water on to heat. She added 2 pieces of wood to the fire, which she had not planned to need until evening. She watched his color slowly change from the gray-white of serious cold exposure to something that looked more like a living man. After 20 minutes, he stopped shaking. After 30, he was able to hold the cup of hot water she gave him. After 45, he spoke. 3 days, he said. His voice was rough, stripped down by exposure to something fundamental. Found a cave on the second ridge when the storm hit. Big limestone shelf goes back about 20 feet. I've used it before in bad weather. Kept a fire going, had enough to eat. You were lucky to find shelter, Eleanor said. I've spent 40 years in these mountains. I know where the shelters are. He looked around the room. The habit of a man who assesses every space he enters, not with suspicion, but with the automatic evaluation of someone who has learned that spaces either keep you alive or they don't. He looked at the walls. He looked at the low ceiling. He looked at the single fire burning in the firebox, which was not a large fire. How long has that fire been burning, he said. I built it up this morning when you knocked. Before that it was coals. I banked it at 10 last night. He looked at the walls again. He stood up carefully, still steadying himself, and walked to the north wall. He put both hands flat on it, held them there. Something changed in his expression. A quality of recognition that was different from ordinary surprise. This was not the surprise of someone seeing something unexpected. This was the surprise of someone seeing something familiar in a place they had not expected to find it. This wall is warm, he said. It takes the heat in during the day and gives it back through the night. The mass of the stone. I know what it is, he said. He said it quietly, not as an interruption, but as a man speaking to himself, confirming something. He stood with his hands on the north wall for another long moment. That cave on the second ridge, he said. Limestone walls 20 feet deep, one opening facing south. 3 days in that cave in the worst storm in 20 years, and I had a small fire and enough warmth to survive. I've thought about that cave 100 times since I first found it. Wondered what made it work when every other hollow in those mountains is just a cold hole. He turned and looked at Eleanor. It's this, he said. Same thing. The rock takes the heat in. The shape keeps the warmth from escaping. The mass holds it through the night. He looked at the room again. The low ceiling, the thick walls, the small south-facing windows, the deep-set door. Your father, he said. Eleanor looked at him. She had not told him anything about her father. The way it's built, Cable said. Someone taught you this. It's not something you figure out on your own. My father was a stonemason from Cornwall. He built this way for 30 years in Colorado. Cable Morrow nodded slowly, the nod of a man connecting something he has experienced to something he is now understanding. Your father understood something, he said, that the rest of us spent 40 years forgetting. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had not diminished. It came against the south wall in long rolling surges, searching for what it had been finding everywhere else in Judith Basin. The gaps, the weaknesses, the places where a building had not been paying attention. It found nothing here. It moved on and came back and moved on again, and the stone stood exactly as it had stood for every previous hour of the storm. Cable sat back down in the chair and drank the rest of his water. How much wood, he said. Eleanor showed him the lean-to through the window. He looked at the stack for a long moment. That's most of what you started with, he said. I've burned about 10 pieces since the storm started. He was quiet for a long time after that, the kind of quiet that belongs to a man recalibrating something he thought he already had fixed. The storm broke on the morning of the fourth day. Not gently. The wind did not taper off. It simply stopped with an abruptness that was almost violent in its own one, as if whatever force had been driving it had decided its work was complete. The silence that followed was the deepest Eleanor had heard since moving to Montana. The kind of silence that has weight that you can feel pressing against your eardrums. She opened the door and stood in the frame. The world was white and still and blinding. The snow had drifted against the old cabin to the east, burying the lower half of the north wall. The lean-to had held its frame hidden under 2 feet of packed snow, but solid underneath when she pushed against it. The wood stack was covered and intact. The stone hut behind her was exactly as she had left it. She looked south toward the settlement. The smoke from the cabins there was thin and tired-looking. Wisps rather than columns. The smoke of fires that had been burning low for a long time fed sparingly, giving back as little warmth as they took fuel. Cable Morrow stood beside her in the doorway. He looked at the settlement smoke. He looked at the wood stack. He looked at the stone walls on either side of the doorframe. I'm going down to the settlement, he said. I'll tell them. You don't need to tell them anything on my account. He looked at her. I'm not doing it on your account, he said. I'm doing it on account of the truth. He left an hour later, walking south through the snow, the shape of him getting smaller as he crossed the flat ground toward the settlement. Eleanor watched him go, then turned and went back inside. The fire had burned down to coals while the door was open. She added 1 piece of wood and went to make breakfast. Ada came down from the loft and stood at the south window looking out at the white world. Is it over? She asked. The storm is over, Eleanor said. What about everything else? Eleanor looked at her daughter, 9 years old, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's habit of asking the question that was actually being asked rather than the one that was easier to answer. Everything else is just starting, Eleanor said. She said it without drama, without particular emphasis. It was simply what she believed. The storm had been the test. What came after the test was different, less acute, less immediately dangerous, but in its own way more consequential. The stone hut had kept her children warm through the worst 4 days the weather had offered. That was settled. What was not settled was what that meant and what it would require of her, and whether the people who had called her hut a root cellar and a widow's grave would be capable of learning something from it. She put the pan on the coals, outside the silence held. The snow caught the early light and threw it back at the squintimy. The stone walls, which had been working all night without anyone asking them to, continued their slow return of everything the fire had given them, steady, patient, unhurried, exactly as her father had said they would. Cable Morrow reached the settlement by mid-morning. He came in from the North Trail, moving through snow that reached his knees in the drifted places and his shins everywhere else. And the people who saw him first were Decker Oaks and two other men who had come outside to assess the damage the storm had left behind. They saw him coming from a distance, a dark figure moving steadily through the white, and waited. He looked like what he was. A man who had been outside in bad weather for 4 days and had survived it by knowing things that most people had forgotten how to know. His coat was stiff with dried ice. His boots had snow packed into the lace holes. But he was walking upright, and his eyes were clear, and that combination, upright and clear-eyed, after 4 days in that storm, carried its own authority. Decker Oaks asked where he had been. Cable told him. The cave on the second ridge. 3 days. Then the stone hut north of the settlement. 1 night. Decker waited for the rest of it. Cable gave it to him plainly, without drama, the way he told everything as information that was either useful or it wasn't. And if it was useful, you would know what to do with it, and if it wasn't, you could leave it where it lay. He told them about the wall that was warm to the touch at 6 in the morning. He told them about the 10 pieces of wood. He told them about the temperature of the air inside, which had been comfortable enough that the children were sleeping without extra blankets in the loft. He told them about the stone giving back the heat through the night steadily and without being asked. The men listened. Decker Oaks said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, 10 pieces of wood for the whole storm. That's what she showed me. We burned through 40 in this house and still had ice on the inside of the north wall by the third morning. I know. Another silence. One of the other men, a homesteader named Reeves, who had moved up from Wyoming the previous spring, said that he didn't see how that was possible. Stone was cold. Everyone knew stone was cold. You put your hand on a stone floor in winter, and your hand told you everything you needed to know about stone and cold. Cabell looked at him with the patient expression of a man who has learned that experience and argument are two different instruments, and only one of them settles questions. Go put your hand on that north wall, he said. Then tell me what stone is. The first visitors arrived that afternoon. They came in ones and twos, finding reasons to ride north, checking on livestock that had drifted during the storm, inspecting fence lines, passing through on the way to somewhere else. Eleanor recognized the pattern before the first horse appeared on the trail. She had lived in small communities long enough to know how curiosity moved through them, sideways dressed as practicality, arriving at its real destination by the longest available route. She did not go out to meet them. She kept working. She had wood to restack a loft to tidy 2 days of laundry backed up from the storm. She let them come to the door, and she opened it, and she invited them in, and she let them stand in the room and feel what it felt like. She did not explain. She had found in the months since she started building that explaining produced argument, and argument produced the need for someone to be right and someone to be wrong, and that particular dynamic was exhausting and pointless, and she was done with it. The room could explain itself. The walls could explain themselves. A hand pressed flat against stone that should have been cold and was instead warm needed no commentary from her. Reeves came first, which surprised her. He was a young man, early 30s, recently arrived from Wyoming, without the entrenched habits of the older settlers. He came in, looked around, put his hand on the wall, and left 20 minutes later without saying much. But he came back the following day with his wife, and his wife stayed for 2 hours asking careful questions about the mortar and the ceiling height and the placement of the firebox. Then came a homesteader named Calloway, the same Birch Calloway, who had offered to bring stone and then not come. He arrived without acknowledging the previous offer or its non-fulfillment, which Eleanor thought was probably the most she could expect from that particular situation, and she let it go completely. He was interested in the north wall and the way it disappeared into the hillside. He kept running his hand along the joint where the stone met the earthen bank. She explained the principle once simply, and he nodded and was quiet and looked at it for a long time. The visits continued. Day by day through the last week of November and into December, people found their way north. Some came from genuine curiosity. Some came because Cable Morrow had told them to, and Cable's word carried weight in the basin, in ways that most other people's words did not. Some came because they had burned through their wood faster than they had planned, and winter was not halfway done, and they needed to know whether what they were hearing was true or was the kind of story that improves with distance from its source. They all found the same thing: a room that was warmer than it had any right to be, given the size of the fire. Walls that were not cold. A ceiling low enough to feel almost intimate. A quality of air that was different from the air in their own homes, not stuffy, not stale, but held contained the way air inside a cave is held and contained without becoming dead. Most of them left without saying much. A few said it outright: they had been wrong. Eleanor accepted this without comment. Wrong about what specifically, she never asked. There were multiple things to have been wrong about, and the particular inventory of each person's errors was their own business. Emmett Stroud arrived on the 24th of November. He was 45 years old and had come to Judith Basin from St. Louis 3 years earlier, bringing with him the habits of a man who had spent 20 years as a land surveyor, a preference for measurement over impression, and the specific distrust of anecdote that comes from having seen too many men make decisions based on what something felt like rather than what it was. He arrived with a thermometer. It was a good one, a mercury column instrument in a brass casing, the kind that cost real money and was accurate to within a degree. He had brought it from St. Louis because he intended to farm scientifically, by which he meant that he intended to make decisions based on data rather than habit. This philosophy had served him reasonably well in 3 Montana winters, though it had also made him somewhat unpopular with neighbors who found his habit of measuring things a silent criticism of their own, less measured approach to life. He introduced himself at the door and explained what he wanted to do. Eleanor looked at the thermometer and then at the man holding it and decided that she had no objection to measurement. "How long do you need?" she asked. "A week, if you'll permit it. Morning, midday, and evening readings, inside and outside both." "Come whenever you need to," she said. "The door will be open." He came every day for 8 days. He was quiet and methodical and took up very little space, which Eleanor appreciated. He took his readings, recorded them in a small leather notebook, thanked her, and left. He did not offer opinions or ask questions beyond what was necessary for the measurements. He was there for the numbers, and the numbers were what he got. On the 3rd day of December, he came not for readings, but for something else. He stood in the doorway with his notebook open. "I've been taking readings at my own cabin as well," he said, "for comparison. I thought you might. Your interior temperature over the past 8 days has ranged from 63 degrees in the morning to 71 in the afternoon. It has never gone below 62 and never above 73. He paused. "My cabin, which is 16 by 18, slightly smaller than this, has ranged from 41 in the morning to 64 in the afternoon. I burned 38 pieces of wood in the same period." He looked at his notebook. Then he looked up. "You burned 16, he said. "I watched you. I counted." Eleanor said nothing. "The temperature differential is approximately 20 degrees on average. The fuel consumption differential is more than 2 to 1 in favor of this structure." He closed the notebook. "These are significant numbers." "Yes," she said, "they are." Emmett Stroud looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has been measuring things long enough to know that some measurements change the shape of everything that came before them. "I'm going to share these numbers at the settlement store," he said. "I think people need to see them." "That's your choice to make," Eleanor said. He shared them the following Saturday when the settlement store was at its fullest, the weekly gathering when people came in for supplies and stayed for conversation, the closest thing Judith Basin had to a town meeting. He read the figures aloud from his notebook plainly, without editorial comment. Temperature readings and wood consumption numbers, and the differential between the stone hut and the standard timber cabin construction of the basin. Eleanor was not there. She had not been invited and had not invited herself. She heard about it afterward from Nora Hewitt, who had been there and who arrived at Eleanor's door the following Monday with a particular expression on her face. Harlan Greer had been at the store when Emmett Stroud read the numbers. Nora told Eleanor this in the careful way of a woman who is conveying information that she knows will matter without being entirely certain how it will land. Harlan had listened to the numbers without speaking. When Stroud finished, several people had responded, some with questions, some with the particular verbal hedging of people who are not yet ready to fully abandon a position they have held publicly. Harlan had said nothing through any of it. He had bought his tobacco and his nails, and he had left. 3 days after the store meeting, he rode north. Eleanor was splitting wood when he came up the trail. She heard the horse before she saw the rider, and when she looked up and saw who it was, she set the axe down and waited. Not with anticipation, not with any particular preparation of what she intended to say. She simply waited in the way she had learned to wait for things that were going to happen, regardless of whether she was ready for them. He rode to within 20 feet of the door and stopped his horse. He looked at the hut. He looked at it the way he had looked at it every time he had ridden past since September's, with the assessing eye of a man who builds things and knows what he is looking at. But something was different now. The certainty that had been in that look before was not entirely there. He dismounted without being invited to and tied his horse to the fence post. He walked to the north wall, not the door of the wall, and stood in front of it. He put one hand on the stone, left it there. His jaw worked slightly the way a man's jaw works when he is running numbers in his head that are not adding up the way he expected. He moved along the wall. He was looking at this mortar joints the way Aldous had looked at them in June, but with different eyes, not looking for failure, looking for explanation. He turned the corner and looked at where the north wall met the hillside at the 3 feet of stone buried in the earth. He looked at the sod banked against the lower courses of the east wall. He looked at the roof, low, heavy sod covered, the same design that had made him call it a root cellar in September. He came to the door and Eleanor stepped aside and he went in. He stood in the center of the room for a longer time. He put his hand on the north wall from the inside. He looked at the low ceiling. He looked at the small south windows. He looked at the firebox, medium-sized, dense river rock, modest chimney, and at the fire burning in it, which was not large. He stood there for what Eleanor estimated was close to an hour and a half. She went about her work. She was not going to manage his experience of the room for him. He had come to find something, and he would find it or he wouldn't, and her explaining it would not change what the room was. Toward the end of the hour, he walked to the firebox and crouched down and looked at the riverstone construction of it. He looked at the chimney throat, the narrow draw that was sized to move smoke without pulling warm air out with it. He straightened. He went to the door. Eleanor followed. He stood in the doorway with one hand on the stone frame and looked back into the room once more. Then he looked at Eleanor. "How thick did you run the north wall?" 2 feet at the base, slightly less toward the top. The buried portion matches the above-ground thickness. He nodded. One slow nod, the kind that belongs to a man filing information in a place where he will be able to find it later. He went to his horse. He mounted. He rode south without looking back. Eleanor stood in the doorway and watched him go. She was not moved by his silence the way she might once have been, not hurt by the absence of an apology, not gratified by the absence of criticism. She was simply present with what had happened, which was that a man who had spent 6 months being wrong had spent an hour and a half trying to understand how, and had asked one question that told her he intended to do something with the answer. That was enough. That was in fact considerably more than she had expected. Aldous Pritchett did not come for 3 weeks after the store meeting. Eleanor did not expect him, and did not look for him, and did not send any word. Whatever Aldous Pritchett did or did not do was Aldous Pritchett's business, and she had her own business to attend to. December moved forward. More visitors came. Henry Marsh, who had lived west of the settlement for 2 years, and whom Eleanor knew only slightly, came with his family and spent a full afternoon. His wife asked about the sod roof and the insulating principle behind it, and Eleanor answered straightforwardly and with the specificity the question deserved. The children ran their hands along the walls and pronounced them warm, with the uncomplicated delight that children bring to things that exceed their expectations. Harlan Greer, without announcement or explanation, began construction of a stone bunkhouse on his ranch property in the 3rd week of December. Eleanor heard about this from Birch Calloway, who had seen the foundation going in. The walls were being built thick. The north side was being set into the slope of the land. Eleanor heard this and felt nothing in particular except a quiet satisfaction that was not about being right. It was about Seth sleeping through the night without a cough. It was about Ada reading by lamplight in a room that did not require a coat. It was about 1.25 cords of wood sitting under the lean-to in December, when every other homestead in the basin was calculating whether they had enough to make it to March. Nora Hewitt came in the 2nd week of December and did not leave for 3 hours. She walked every inch of the interior, examined the mortar joints, looked at the firebox construction, stood under the lowest point of the ceiling, with her hand raised to measure the distance from her palm to the sod above. "I was wrong," she said. which for Nora Hewitt was a statement of considerable personal cost, and Eleanor received it accordingly without minimizing it or amplifying it. You hadn't seen it work yet, Eleanor said. You had every reason to reserve judgment. I didn't reserve judgment. I made it. Yes, Eleanor said. You did. Nora looked at her for a moment. Then she almost smiled. You're not going to make this easy for me, are you? I'm not trying to make it hard. I'm just being accurate. That's the same thing sometimes. Eleanor considered this. Sometimes, she agreed. Nora called the hut a fortress before she left, standing in the doorway and looking back at the room with an expression that had moved past professional assessment into something more personal. It is, Eleanor said. That's exactly what it is. Aldous Pritchett arrived on a Tuesday morning in the last week of December. He came alone without announcing himself on a gray morning when the temperature had dropped back below zero and the sky had the particular heavy look of more weather considering its options. Eleanor heard a horse outside and looked through the south window and saw him tying up at the fence post. She opened the door before he knocked. He came in with the careful movements of a man who is uncertain of his reception and is managing that uncertainty through physical deliberateness. He took off his hat. He looked at the room with the eyes of a craftsman, involuntary professional, seeing joints and courses and measurements before he saw anything else. He had a roll of paper under his arm. Eleanor said nothing. She waited. He stood in the center of the room for a moment, looking up at the ceiling the way he had in June, but differently now. In June, he had been looking for what was wrong. Now he was looking at what was right, and the difference was visible in the set of his expression. He was reading the room the way a skilled tradesman reads a structure he respects, taking it apart in his mind to understand how it was put together. Then he unrolled the paper on the table. It was a drawing, a floor plan, and two elevation views done with the precision of a man who had been drawing building plans for 20 years. The structure it depicted was not a cabin in the standard sense. It was something between a cabin and what Eleanor had built, a hybrid that used log framing for parts of the structure, but incorporated a thick stone wall on the north face and a stone firebox mass against the west interior wall that extended from floor to ceiling. The stone mass was drawn with detail courses marked mortar joints indicated the north wall shown in cross-section to illustrate the thickness. He had calculated or attempted to calculate the thermal mass of the stone relative to the volume of the room. He stood back from the drawing and looked at Eleanor. Tell me if I got the north wall right, he said. His voice was even, professionally neutral, the tone he would use with any client presenting plans for review. But underneath it, in the slight care with which he had placed those words, was something that was neither neutral nor professional. It was the voice of a man who has spent 30 days privately dismantling a certainty he had held for 20 years, and is now holding out what he has built in its place, not sure if it will stand. Eleanor looked at the drawing. She looked at it carefully, not quickly, not with the cursory glance of someone performing attention, but with genuine concentration. She followed the north wall in elevation, reading the thickness he had specified, checking the proportions against the room dimensions. She looked at the cross-section detail. She looked at the chimney throat measurement. She picked up the pencil he had left beside the drawing. She drew a single line on the north wall cross-section, adjusting the base thickness from what he had drawn 18 inches to 24. She wrote the measurement beside the line. She set the pencil down. The rest of it is right, she said. The north wall needs to be thicker at the base. Everything else will work. Aldous looked at the correction. He looked at it for a long time the way he had looked at the room. He was checking her reasoning. She understood not from distrust, but from the habit of a craftsman who does not accept a correction without understanding why it is correct. He was running the thermal mass calculation in his head with the new measurement, and she waited while he did it. He nodded. Once. The same kind of nod Harlan Greer had produced, that single movement of a man filing information in a reliable place. He rolled the drawing. He picked it up. He looked at her once more with an expression that she could not fully read and did not try to. It contained several things at once: the professional respect of one builder for another, something more uncomfortable that was related to the public criticism he had offered in June, and underneath both of those things, something simpler and more human. The expression of a man who has spent his working life being good at something and has just encountered evidence that there is a dimension of that thing he had not understood. Thank you, he said. Build it right, she said. That's all. He put his hat on and went out. She heard his horse move away south. She stood at the south window and watched him go, and she thought about her father. She thought about Silas Webb at a drawing table in Colorado, pencil in hand, working out measurements for a stone room that would still be standing when everyone who criticized it was long gone. She thought about the way he had looked when someone got it right, not pleased with himself, but pleased with the thing itself, the structure, the principle, the fact that it worked and went on working independent of whether anyone acknowledged it. She thought he would have said nothing to Aldous either. He would have made the correction and let the building do the rest. January came, and February, and the winter that had announced itself so violently in November continued to be what it had promised to be: long, cold, and uncompromising. The second storm in January was not as severe as the November blizzard, but was cold enough and long enough to take 3 cattle from Harlan Greer's herd and collapse the roof of an outbuilding on the Reeves claim. Eleanor burned wood at the same rate she had been burning it since October. Steady, measured, never urgent. By the end of January, her wood stack had diminished by perhaps a third from where it had started in November. Every other homestead in the basin had resupplied at least once, some of them twice hauling timber from the creek bottoms and splitting it green because the seasoned wood was gone. Emmett Stroud kept his thermometer running through January and February, and he kept sharing the numbers at the settlement store. The differential between Eleanor's interior temperature and the average of 3 other cabins he was measuring held steady, roughly 18 to 20 degrees, at a fuel consumption ratio of nearly 2.5 to 1. The number stopped producing argument by February. They had been present long enough to become simply what was true, the way things become true when they survive sufficient contact with reality. Harlan Greer finished his stone bunkhouse in the first week of March. It was not built exactly the way Eleanor had built hers. He had used timber framing for the roof structure, which was different, and the ceiling was slightly higher than she would have made it. But the north wall was thick. Aldous Pritchett had built it with the corrected measurement, and the firebox was dense river rock against the west interior wall, and the building was set into the slight slope of the ground on the north side in a way that suggested someone had thought carefully about what the ground could do. His ranch hands moved in on the day it was finished. By the first night, they had used less than half the wood they would have burned in the old bunkhouse for the same period of time. Harlan rode north on a Thursday morning in early March, which surprised Eleanor because the snow was still deep and the ride was not easy. She saw him coming from the window and went to the door. He rode to the fence post and tied up and came to the door. "The bunkhouse is finished," he said. "I heard," she said. He looked at the stone hut, nodded her at the structure, at the walls and the low roof line, and the place where the north side met the hill. "Aldous built the north wall to your measurement," he said. "Good. It held through the January storm. Boys didn't lose any sleep." Eleanor said nothing. Harlan looked at her then, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen on him before. Not the certainty of September or the calculating assessment of December. Something that was more settled and more uncomfortable at the same time, the way a man looks when he has come to do something he has never done before and is not sure he is doing it correctly. "I called it a root cellar," he said. "Yes," she said. "You did." A silence. He looked at the hut again. "It kept your children warm," he said, "through the worst storm in 20 years. 10 pieces of wood." "Yes," he nodded once. He untied his horse and mounted. "You built it right," he said, and he rode south. Eleanor stood in the doorway and let the cold air come in around her and watched him go. It was not an apology. She had not needed an apology. What it was, "you built it right," was something more rare and more valuable than an apology. It was recognition from a man who did not offer it casually, offered in the only terms he had for it. She accepted it as what it was. Spring came late as it does in Montana, grudging and incremental, the cold retreating 1 degree at a time, as if reconsidering each degree before releasing it. In March and April, the building began. Not everyone, not all at once, but across Judith Basin in ones and twos, homesteaders and ranchers began to rethink what they were living in. Some built full stone structures on Eleanor's model, small, thick-walled, low-ceilinged, set into the land rather than placed on top of it. Others added stone to what they had: a thick interior wall against the cold side of an existing cabin, a stone firebox mass to replace a smaller hearth. Some simply rebuilt their hearths with denser stone and shorter chimney draws. The shapes were all different. The principle was the same: thick mass, low ceiling, minimal openings, the land itself used as insulation wherever the ground permitted. Stone that took heat in and gave it back slowly through the coldest hours of the coldest nights. Nobody called it Eleanor's method. Nobody called it anything which Eleanor thought was the most honest thing that could happen to an idea. It stopped being her idea and became simply the way things were done, which was where good ideas belonged. Not attached to a name, not requiring credit. Just present in the world doing what they did, outlasting the opinions that had come before them. Emmett Stroud wrote a letter to a land office in Helena describing the building principles he had observed with measurements and temperature data appended. Whether anyone read it or acted on it, Eleanor never knew. Aldous Pritchett built 4 stone-walled structures that spring and summer. His reputation, rather than suffering from the correction he had received in December, grew. He had the particular credibility of a craftsman who has learned something new late in his career and incorporated it without pretending he had always known it. People trusted that kind of honesty. Work found him. Nora Hewitt began teaching a lesson in her school about stone and wood and heat and the way different materials held temperature differently. She drew diagrams on the blackboard. She sent her students home with the question, "Feel your wall tonight and feel it again in the morning and tell me what it remembers." Most of them came back with answers that surprised them. Eleanor kept living the way she had been living. She got up before light. She built the fire from coals. She made breakfast for the children. She worked the claim through the spring planting season and the summer growing and the fall harvest. She split wood in October and stacked it under the lean-to and looked at how much she had and felt as she had felt the previous year that it was enough. It was always enough. Ada turned 10 in May and started keeping a journal the way her teacher encouraged the older students to do. In November, a year after the great blizzard, Eleanor came across the journal open on the table where Ada had left it. She did not read it. She had not been invited to read it. But the page it was open to had a drawing on it, not writing a drawing, a floor plan and an elevation. Small, careful, done with the particular precision of a 9-year-old who has grown up watching someone measure things with a plumb line. The drawing was of the stone hut. Eleanor stood over it for a long moment. She looked at the north wall as Ada had drawn it, thick at the base buried in the hillside. She looked at the low roof line. She looked at the small, south-facing windows and the deep-set door. The proportions were right. Not perfect, Ada was 10, but right in the ways that mattered. The child had been watching. The child had understood what she was watching, and the child had put it on paper. Below the drawing, Ada had written one sentence in her careful schoolroom hand. "This is how you build a house that keeps you warm." Eleanor stood at the table in the stone hut that her father's knowledge had made possible, and her own hands had built, listening to the silence that thick walls produce. And she thought about the stonemason from Cornwall, who had taught her that stone didn't fight the cold, that it simply waited, that patience was not passivity, but a form of power that outlasted everything that came against it. She thought about the plumb line he had given her, which was hanging on the wall beside the door, exactly where she had put it the day she moved in. She thought about what it meant to pass something forward, not as instruction, not as lesson, not as the deliberate transfer of knowledge from one generation to the next, but simply as living. As doing the thing the right way consistently in front of someone who was watching. Ada had been watching. The stone hut stood on the hillside north of what would become Lewistown, Montana, and it would stand there for another 140 years through winters that would have surprised even the winter of 1883. The roof would be replaced 3 times. The door would be rehung twice. Emmett Stroud's thermometer readings would be found in an archive in Helena in 1971 by a graduate student writing a thesis on frontier building practices, and the thesis would note the unusual efficiency of the structure with the kind of careful academic language that strips wonder out of things in the process of documenting them. The walls would not move. Step inside on a winter afternoon, which you still can, because the structure still stands and the land it sits on is still accessible and you will feel it. The air is different in there, still and held and steady in a way that has nothing to do with any fire currently burning, because there is no fire currently burning. It is the stone remembering, taking in the thin winter sun through the south-facing windows and holding it the way it held the heat of every fire that Cormac Vance's widow built in it through the long winters of her life there. A frontier laughed, a blizzard came. The stone hut answered without raising its voice, without fighting, without doing anything except what stone does, when it has been placed correctly by someone who understood that the oldest materials used with patience and knowledge and the willingness to be called foolish before being proved right do not need to be defended. They only need to stand. And stand it did.